But first, it says everything about how badly governed we are that the proposal to put a new flagpole on the Sydney Harbour Bridge so that the Aboriginal flag can be flown permanently will cost taxpayers $25 million at a time when those same taxpayers face crippling cost of living increases. $25 million. Far too much to do something that should not be done from a government that should have better priorities. Okay, putting a 20-metre flagpole high on a heritage structure is not exactly a handyman's job. Still, $25 million is astronomical. What does it say about the public servants running the New South Wales government construction projects that they thought this was reasonable enough to put on the Premier's desk? Didn't it occur to them that this was absurd? Or have they become so used to millions and millions of dollars on useless, unnecessary, bloated planning processes with their endless liaising, coordinating, facilitating that $25 million for a minor work struck them as normal? And what does it say about the quality of our elected leaders who have become so accustomed to doing what they're told by bureaucrats and so reliant on their so-called advice that this particularly ludicrous piece of advice was not rejected out of hand?
Well, Ben, the whole process to me has been incredibly frustrating, and not just the time that it takes. I mean, the advice I've received from the department has been that at its initial stage was that it would take a couple of years to achieve, and now the cost has come back at $25 million. And from my perspective, as I was saying yesterday, it doesn't seem to pass the pub test.
What sort of leader keeps making excuses for this public service clowns? I mean, is it any wonder that nothing much happens fast and anything that does happen takes years and years and years and costs billions and billions? In trying to explain the inexplicable, even the New South Wales Premier Don Perrottet confessed his bewilderment, lamenting why government decisions take so long to be done.
Now, I understand there's probably complexities to it. It's a heritage bridge, as we would all know. The size of these flagpoles are the equivalent of a 6-storey building, so it's not a small task. I accept that, and there are challenges with it, but it certainly shouldn't be costing the taxpayers $25 million. And I can assure you, as a former treasurer, you work through it and you do everything you can to make sure that the taxpayers of New South Wales get value for money. So, as I said, I would go to Bunnings and get it. Yeah, that was probably lighthearted. I was incredibly frustrated by this entire process every step of the way.
But as radio host Ben Fordham put it to the Premier this morning, if it really is so important to fly the Aboriginal flag, why not fly it in one of the other 2 existing flagpoles? After all, that's where the Aboriginal flag already flies for 19 days a year, in place of the New South Wales state flag and alongside the national flag to mark NIDOC Week and other days of Aboriginal commemoration. But this isn't just a question of millions for a flagpole. The biggest question is, why should the Aboriginal flag be flown permanently as opposed to on special Indigenous occasions? Now, I'm all in favour of trying to ensure Aboriginal people have an honoured place as our first Australians and support measures to end Indigenous disadvantage, trying to get kids to school and adults to work in remote communities, keep them safe. But if this is about unity, as the Premier tries to claim, why is a flag representing some of us going to get equal standing with a flag that represents all of us?
And I think it's an important decision that we've made. I think it brings unity to our country, and it's a small price to pay for that unification.
Seriously, does anyone think a flag on the bridge will change the log of demands from Indigenous activists? Listen to this spray today from the Greens leader Adam Band when a journalist asks his staffer why the Australian flag has been removed from his press conference to just leave the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags.
You chose not to stand in front of the Australian flag. Why is that?
Well, I think we've got a lot of work to do in this country to tell the truth. We've got a lot of work to do to overcome the racism and dispossession that many First Nations and Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous people face. We should start to fly the First Nations flags in Parliament. It's time to understand that the history of this country and the symbols that represent the history of this country are very hurtful to the First Nations people of this country.
Right, just so that we're all clear on the protocol around official flags. Australia has a number of official flags. The Aboriginal flag's just one of them, but we have only one national flag. And the rules that govern the national flag are enshrined in the Flags Act 1953. Now, what troubles me, and this happens in Canberra too, where people should know better, is the growing trend to fly the Aboriginal flag alongside the national flag and to use it in media events that stage it on the same level as the Australian flag. Now, if you want to include the Aboriginal flag, that's one thing, and clearly that's been a decision for the new Prime Minister, but in my view, the Australian flag, our one national flag, should always be more prominent. It should always fly higher than any other flag, and it should always be at the centre of any flag display, as no other flag has the same standing in law as the flag that represents all of us. What's also interesting here is that flying the Aboriginal flag all year round on top of the Harbour Bridge didn't have the support of the former Premier Gladys Berejiklian, if reports are accurate. So this Perrottet decision, is this Perrottet looking for a way to diffuse criticism before the March election that perhaps he's too conservative? If so, he'd be the latest in a long line of Liberal leaders who've tried to be re-elected by being what they're not. Liberal governments are not elected to outspend Labor and to be even more politically correct than their opponents. The Morrison government tried to scratch every electoral itch by throwing more money at it and often declined to stand up for Liberal values. Now look what happened to it. At the federal poll, voters preferred the real thing to Labor light. And that's likely to be the same fate for the New South Wales Liberals come next March if the Premier doesn't wake up and start to take back control of his government from his ultra-woke Treasurer, Matt Keane. For instance, today's pre-budget announcement is that the New South Wales Government will spend an additional $500 million to abolish the red tape holding up building approvals and adding to the cost of new homes in New South Wales. Now, hang on. Why does it cost $500 million to remove red tape? Didn't it occur to anyone to interrogate the officials coming forward with this crazy spending proposal and tell them, come back with something that actually saves money rather than cost taxpayers and makes government smaller, not bigger? Because this is what we actually elect governments to do, but not to virtue signal with flagpoles that cost way more than they should.